Welcome to part 3 of this special series where I'll be going through one branch of my family tree, going over who these people were, how I came to the conclusions that I got to, and just as importantly, what I have and have not been able to learn about them. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I want to try to give you guys a pretty decent understanding of just how different each individual line can be to trace. So sometimes you find the things you're looking for, other times you don't. And the tactics and strategies that you have to use to research Jewish families differ based on the individual circumstances and situations of that family. I'm really excited to talk about this one because my Mielnicki family is one of the first branches that I ever researched where I learned an extensive amount about their relationship with the Holocaust. I'm Yonah Paley and I believe genealogy is fun. And on today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the family tree of my great-grandmother, Rose Minnick, born Rachel Mielnicki, and try to see how I was able to learn about her family. Since I know that Rachel, who married my great-grandfather Louis Paley, came to the US sometime in the early 1900s, what I first did, as you usually should do with Jewish immigrants to the United States, is I traced her backwards on US censuses. I was able to find out that she had been living with her family in New York, and on some of the earlier censuses, she is living with her mother, Anna. And here's the thing, is the family was named Minnick, but I had been told that Minnick wasn't the original surname, that it had been anglicized somewhat. This is really an instance where, until I figured out what the name was, the branch was kind of a mystery, and once I managed to figure that name out, the floodgates just opened wide up. From a combination of both an A file, which is a special alien immigrant file that if people who immigrated to the United States after a certain time essentially have this dossier on them, and you can apply through the US archive.gov website, and you pay, depending on their year of birth, between, I think it's like $20 to $50, and they'll send you this dossier with sometimes scans of naturalization and immigration documents that they and the government had filled out. And from this, in combination with just being very crafty with regards to, I was able to find out that she had immigrated to the US under the name Rachel Mielnicki. Thankfully, it was a very specific spelling on all of their manifests. So I was able to find out that her and many of her brothers came to the US between the late 1890s and mid-1900s. She was actually the only daughter out of a bunch of guys. Her mother, who was named Alti, which we'll get to that in the next video on her side of the family, but she was named Alti, and on her ship manifest, she was already widowed, meaning the father of all the Mielnickis, or as I found out later, Mielnickis, essentially came to the US after the father had died. It wasn't too difficult to figure out what the name of the father was, because on Rachel's marriage certificate, as well as the fact that all of the siblings pretty much named a child Aaron, or some variation of Aaron. So some of them named a child Arthur, names like that, Arnold, but the Hebrew name was always Aaron, and that's because they all named a child after the deceased father. The ship manifests in combination with World War I draft cards from some of the brothers consistently shows that the town that they came from was called Wasilkow, a small village in the Białystok region of Poland. And there weren't any records immediately available on JRI Poland or Jewish Gen for Wasilkow. But thankfully, through family search, there actually are some microfilms of metrical records in Wasilkow. Not too many, but from these records, I was able to find the birth of one of Aaron and his wife's children. And that document showed that, first of all, Alti, it's a very special type of name where it's an apotropaic name, which means it wasn't her birth name. And once again, I'll get more into that in depth on the next episode. But her original name on this birth record was actually Liebe Fredel. And I know that her last name was Levin. So Aaron and Liebe Fredel Levin had this child. And from the birth record, it says that Aaron's father was named Hirsch. In addition to Aaron, Hirsch also had another son called Manis. And both Manis and Aaron had children in Wasilkow, but they lived in a nearby town of Suraz. There weren't any records saying when Aaron was born or died, but from naming patterns, we're actually able to learn approximately when Aaron died. His kids all named a child after him, and from taking the dates of the births of these children, I was able to narrow down the time frame to sometime before the 1900s. But really the big kicker is the fact that his youngest child was actually also named Aaron, which indicates very strongly to me that the father actually died shortly before this son was born, because you usually in Judaism only name a child after the father if the father has died, at least in Ashkenazi Jewish naming traditions. So from this, it seems that Aaron, even though we don't know when he was born, he probably died around 1896. Now, a major discovery of this family was that there were actually two brothers of Rose or Rachel who never immigrated to the United States, and one of them, named Chaim, was actually murdered in the Holocaust, something that my family had no idea of until I discovered some pages of testimony through Yad Vashem, and then more miraculously, a book written by Chaim's son, Michel. And Michel Mielnicki wrote a book called Białystok to Birkenau, where he details his experience going through the Holocaust. And it's a very, very harrowing story. But he gave all this testimony, and the book was written through somebody else who did a lot of interviews with him. And then this guy, John Monroe, transcribed those interviews, and then the book was written from the details of this. And I was very lucky, after contacting the Vancouver Holocaust Center, to get access to some of the audio files of the original interviews with Michel Mielnicki, and it revealed something really incredible to me. The thing that proved that this was definitely my family was, in one of the interviews, he's asked about his uncles and aunts, and he says, oh yeah, they moved to upstate New York and changed their last name to Minnick. That's pretty much like hitting gold when you find an interview from somebody who explicitly references your family. And yeah, there was just no knowledge of this other brother who was murdered, which just goes to show you that through the waves of immigration and oppression in Eastern Europe, a lot of times families basically stopped having communication with one another, And in many cases, they didn't even know that their own siblings were murdered in the Holocaust. Now, I don't know exactly what the occupation of Aaron or Hirsch Mielnicki were, but it seems that a lot of the Mielnickis, from Yizkor books that I've read and just a few records here and there, it seems that a lot of the Mielnickis were weavers, which makes me think there's a high chance that they probably had that same profession, but who knows? I'm confident that at some point I'll probably learn more about this family, but the actual records in that town seem to be pretty limited. There are huge gaps in the years missing. So this is one of those instances where it's pretty much a waiting game, trying to figure out, whether more records come to light. And that wraps up our episode. If you liked it, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the YouTube channel. As always, I'm looking forward to bringing you more videos about famous Jews, as well as tips and tricks that you can use in your own genealogy research. So thank you so much for watching, and we'll get you next time.